Hello. Okay, welcome everybody to this session where Riason is going to engage with Salah Hassan around NKA and other projects.
Who are you?
Oh, okay. Who am I? My name is Mario Pizarro. I'm an art historian, and I have the pleasure of moderating this discussion. I'm pleased to introduce Salah Hassan, who I think all of us will acknowledge has played a very pivotal role in the whole development of the field of modern and contemporary African art. Salah was born in Juba, in what is today South Sudan. He currently lives and works between Ithaca and Charjah. Salah Hassan is an art historian, critic and curator whose work focuses on African and African diaspora art history and visual cultures, as well as the black intellectual tradition. Hassan is director of the Africa Institute in Charjah. He's also distinguished professor of arts and sciences and director of the Institute for Comparative Modernities, as well as professor of art history and visual culture in the Africana Studies and Research Center and the Department of History of Art and Visual Studies at Cornell University in Ithaca, United States. Hassan has curated a number of international exhibitions, including major ones at the Venice and Dakar Biennales. He's also curated or co-curated exhibitions such as the touring When Art Becomes Liberty, the Egyptian Surrealists, which was first shown at the Charjah Art Foundation in 2016, as well as the Khartoum School, the making of the modern art movement in Sudan, among many other exhibitions. He's founding editor of NKA, Journal of Contemporary African Art, and has also authored, edited, and co-edited a number of books and journals, including Ibrahim el-Salahi, a visionary modernist, African Modernism, a special issue of the South Atlantic Quarterly, Diaspora Memory Place, Unpacking Europe, Authentic Eccentric, and Gendered Visions, the art of contemporary Africana women artists. He's the recipient of several grants and fellowships and was recently honored as the 2021 Distinguished Professor by the College Art Association, the oldest and largest scholarly organization for history and criticism of the visual arts in the US. Salah will be interviewed by Riason Naidoo. Riason is my homeboy. He was born in Durban, South Africa. He was a visiting scholar at the National Institute for Art History here in 2020. Prior to that, he was director of the South African National Gallery, director of the South African Mali project on the manuscripts of Timbuktu, artistic project manager at the French Institute in South Africa, lecturer in drawing and painting at the University of Witwatersrand, head of art education at the Durban Art Gallery. He has created numerous projects, including the public art project Any Given Sunday in Cape Town, retrospective exhibitions of the artist Peter Clark, which were in Paris, London, and Dakar, and the exhibition 1910 to 2010 from Pionniers to collectifs at the South African National Gallery, which offered a new look at a century of South African art, as well as the Indian in Drum magazine in the 1950s, which toured from 2006 to 2011. This last project resulted in a book published in 2008 and a documentary, Legends of the Casbah. Naidoo was co-curator of the 10th edition of the Dakar Biennale. He was also curator of NUF 3, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing wrong, a public art project with contemporary African art installed in the city of Saint-Denis. Naidoo has been on residencies at the Cité des Arts in Paris, CAPC, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Bordeaux, and to the Faculty of Fine Arts in Baroda. He was awarded the title of Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters from France in 2016. So we now can look forward to a conversation. I'm going to ask you, Riason, to please lead the way.
Thank you, Mario. And hello, Salah, great to have you with us. I know you had a flight yesterday from the US to Charjah, so I hope you are well rested. It's a great privilege to be able to interview you here as part of the conference. which is entitled Pioneers of Contemporary African Art. And it is in the context, yourself, Olu Ogwibe, Okwi Enwezo, Chika Okeke, who many of us in this room, curators and art historians and writers, look to for having paved the way for many of us coming in the next generation. I want to start, I thought about this, this interview. We had been talking for some time about how to do this, but one of the things that, one of the themes that I wanted to focus on in this conference was, how many of us from the continent start out as artists. Temin Kosi, myself, Mario, perhaps you also. And then along the way, we become, we get involved in art history and we start writing, etc. And I think for you and Olu Ogwibe and perhaps Chika Okeke, that has most certainly been the case, and you've then also gone on to become, very prominent art historians with a track record of publications. Speaking of publications, you were one of the founders of NKA, launched in 1994. I understand that the journal was founded by yourself, Okwi Enwezo, Olu Ogwibe. Can you tell us a little bit about how this came about and why?
Well, thank you so much to both of you, Mario and Riason, for this opportunity. Thank you, Mario, for the kind introduction. I'll never forget the first time that I met you, which was in my first visit to South Africa. I think it is 1996, from what I recall, just shortly after the end of apartheid and the first Johannesburg Biennial. I met you and Tembe, who ended up later on at Cornell. I don't know if you remember that. You took me to my first visit to District 6, if you remember that. But thank you for the kind introduction, and same to you, Riason, for the kind also opportunity to speak to you about the NKA. But let me begin first by the introduction that many of us who are in this field, which really took shape in the kind of a mid-90s, because prior to that, the field was really controlled or dominated by mostly Euro-American scholars who came from an anthropology or other field into art history, but they were the typical traditionalists who really involved in studying what they call, traditional African art, and I would like to call it classical tradition of African art. But we made our way into that field, and I, like Olu, like Chika, among many others, we started as an artist. I started as an artist, but then we sensed the need for creating this kind of an opportunity or a window to study the contemporary and the modern experience. And I like to distinguish between the two, even though there is a continuity. Where does the modern end, where does the contemporary? That has always been a subject at the beginning of us entering and trying to shape the field in a way that we can. So that is, of course, linked to NKA, is that besides studying art history in American universities, where myself, Olu was in England at the SOAS, and myself and Chika were in the American system. So we tried, because we found that the challenging thing, or the major challenge for us was that the very raw material of art history, or this kind of an art history of contemporary modern, didn't exist. So how do you do it? It's through two ways. One is, of course, through exhibitions, because that will help you create the very raw material itself, because it's easy for Europeans, art historians of the contemporary modern, to theorize or to write, because artists of that kind, Euro-American artists, are already in the museum, are already collected by major galleries and contemporary art museums. But also that they exist, even if you go in the early modern, they exist in the museum. So for us, it was the exhibit and publications have been major. So we started, of course, by creating exhibitions. It was not an easy route, but we managed and succeeded gradually. And then NKA becomes an important forum because at that time, there was only African Art Magazine. Ironically, African Art Magazine, which is published by UCLA, it started actually as a forum for the contemporary, but then shifted to become for a long time dominated by the typical traditionalists in the field. And it was only recently, maybe a decade or so, that it started opening up to a much more contemporary or modern discourse of African art. But that had to do with the shift in the field. We can speak about it later. But the story of NKA started with an initiative from Oakley, who I actually recall very well that we met. He approached me about starting a magazine. And I said, let's meet and talk. And I remember very well that we met at the African Studies Association meeting in Toronto. That was the first actually time that I met Oakley. He traveled by train from New York, and I was at the State University of New York at Buffalo in my first job after graduation from UPenn. And we met there, and we worked on the first maquette of the first issue of NKA. And that was the beginning of the story. An issue or two after, it was published originally like self-funded by us, but then it was in Brooklyn at Oakley's apartment. And then about the second or third issue, I managed through funding from Cornell to have it there. And then the rest of the story is history. And then later on, I think about 10 years into the publishing NKA, that Duke University approached us, and we actually also approached them, and we reached an agreement for them to become the publisher, with us controlling the content, editing, but also the design. And that is how the agreement actually worked. So we were happy really to work with them. Decided being a prominent, a good press. It also helped us a great deal take off the burden of the distribution and other things, and made it easier for us to really have it as an academic journal, but it's also accessible, meaning other than academics, meaning museum curators, collectors, other people who are in the art could have access to it, and so on. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. That confirms some of the rumors that were floating around. But I mean, at this time, just before NKA, there was also Third Text, and then in Paris in 1991 we had Revue Noire. And Revue Noire describes itself as a magazine of contemporary African art. And in NKA, there's a small distinction, which is journal of contemporary African art. And what is that difference for you? I mean, was it about trying to create an English version of Revue Noire, which came 2 years or 3 years before? Or was it about creating something more academic in terms of journals? What is the identity of NKA?
Let me just say one thing, that is, actually, Revue Noire is a very important magazine, and I feel bad that it was not published anymore, because it's the first magazine, actually, to make images of contemporary art available. It was, nicely published, glossy, and it has good quality images. It is one of those journals that are actually accessible to the public. It is halfway academic, meaning it combined the public appeal the tendency of the essays there, of Revue Noire, is that it's image-oriented or image-driven rather than essay-driven, meaning there are essays that are very useful in it, and in fact, for me, it's the first access to many of these artists that came to be known later on in the 90s and so forth, because they did actually have special issues and they cover country by country. So one, I wanted to really not underestimate the role of Revue Noire, and I felt it is bad that it is not published anymore, but it maybe had to do with the the policy or politics of France at the time, because it seems to be the 90s were the decade of africain, among many others, organization that really had genuine interest and is only run by people like Simon Mjami, Florence Alexis, among others, who are of Black or African descent and who are genuinely interested in actually presenting African art to the larger public, especially in Europe, and also have their own roots and back and forth to the continent itself. So I must acknowledge that. But the difference is the type of essays, which tend to be shorter. For us, it's a journal that's hybrid. It's academic, it's almost refereed in a sense that most of the time, at that time, you can't really have it as a totally academic and refereed, because that would require, kind of availability of writers, which at the time doesn't exist. There were very few people who actually did PhD in art history or trained in African art history in a way that you could say, like in other forms of art history or areas of art history. Very few people at that time with degrees in art history even to solicit essay from. So it is academic in a way, but it's also hybrid, where we solicit essays, we also solicit reviews. So that's the difference. We try to create something that totally focus on the African art. But the other difference is that we define Africa globally, in a sense that our magazine look at Africa and the diaspora. So it has African American, it has Afro-Caribbean, it has Black British, among many others. And it's not really necessarily African or continental based, although we give much attention to continent. Like just you look at the issue that is on the screen. There is Samuel Fosu, there is Coco Fusco, Barclay Hendricks, and so forth, among other African based. So we thought of Africa globally, because at that time, even African studies started to shift from being a sub-Saharan based, and that is one thing that we were very glad to break, that these kind of artificial boundaries in African studies, where North Africa is perceived to be Arab or Caucasian or something like that, and sub-Saharan Africa is the real Black and real Africa thing, which is actually a dichotomy or artificial boundary inherited from the colonial perspective of African studies overall, which was tend to be dominated by people who have a certain ideas about Africa, in which, and we challenge that perception, because we thought of Africa as an intellectual construct, that it means different things to different people. And one thing that one had to accept is that Africa is diverse, Africa is complex, and Africa has all elements of races and so on, because it's a dynamic continent, but it's also reshaped by the colonial and the enslavement experience, so that it can't be Africa that is a geographic entity. It has to be perceived as a global presence. So that was one of the, as you say, the ideological or at least the theoretical paradigms that influenced our work from the beginning. And that's what set NKA apart from other magazines, that we were not burdened by this colonial representation of the continent or colonial paradigms in the field of African studies.
Sorry, I've got this question in my mind, but I've heard also that you were trained as a graphic designer, and I'm wondering how this has impacted, in some of the NKA covers and some of your publications. Has that influenced you in your career as an art historian and curator and publisher? If it's true, that means, yeah.
It did in a way, but I wouldn't say that I'm alone the person who really shaped the design. I mean, it really came as a collective. In the earlier days, it was designed in New York by a colleague, and I'm kind of blocking the name for a minute, but I will remember it. But then it came to, when it came to Cornell, at some point we shifted, and there was a designer who unfortunately passed away in 2016, that is Rames Elias. So I don't know if you remember the older one. It used to be like a magazine size. We reduced it to what is now like this. This is, by the way, the most recent issue, which is a special issue on Egyptian surrealism. So we made the size small because we felt we needed something that semi-academic that can also fit into your shelf without bending after a while. Because the larger size, I really, all of us agree that is not the best size. So that is, but I think the design, I couldn't say that I shaped it alone. The logo or the main title has been designed earlier. And then later on, there was some modification that happened. And if you say just my interest in the art as a graphic designer or as a painter early on, came because we felt, as you mentioned it earlier in the field, and in fact, this extends to African-American art too. The first generation of African-American art historians, whether it's Rick Powell, Michael Harris, and others, were all people who are actually painters and trained as fine art artists, and then later on went into a PhD program. I did not do that. I actually, my story is a little bit funny. I was accepted at the College of Fine Applied Art. I couldn't pursue it because at the time, my mother, God bless her soul, thought that I should be a doctor and a medical doctor. I enrolled in the pre-clinic stage at the University of Khartoum. And then at some point in the second year, I felt, no, I wanted to study philosophy. I shifted completely to the, what we call it colleges, but it's called in Sudan, the University of Khartoum Faculty of Arts. And I shifted there to major in history and philosophy and did an honor degree, a Bachelor of Honors in philosophy. Then I went on to study at Penn, where I really focused originally on a totally different subject, which is art and Islamic literacy in northern Nigeria, which is basically looking at Hausa and in connection to Islamic literacy in terms of architecture, costumes, and design, and so forth. But that helped me a great deal, or gave me the grounding in the classical tradition, and so I moved into the contemporary. That I sometimes encourage people, but there's an enthusiasm to move into the modern and contemporary without thinking about that. Because as if you want to abandon it for the traditionally white scholars, Euro-American scholars, and then shift completely to the modern. I think the modern or modernity or modernism in Africa is also grounded in some of these classical traditions. There is a dialectic or a dialogue, as you see. It's not, of course, the only source for people like Salahi and others, but it is somehow right there as one of these sources that many of the contemporary artists sought inspiration. Even African-American artists. You cannot think about Afri-Cobra or Wousi Asana or any other movement that came in the diaspora in the 1960s and 70s without thinking about the classical tradition. But also without thinking about the major festivals of art like Dakar, 1966, or Festag, or Algiers, 1969, because these are the places where a lot of Black diaspora or African diaspora, Caribbean diaspora, Brazilian Africans too, actually intellectuals or artists or poets flocked to Africa to attend this. And especially at that time, you have to remember as the Black Power movement in the Europe, or the Black Art movement in the United States, or Black Art movement or Black Power in the US, or raging, it was the same era of decolonization in Africa, it's the 60s. So that intellectual connection is very important to think about, that those gatherings, even though it was a gathering that was unique in Zimbabwe when it was called Namibia, that was co-founded by Frank McCowan, which is a unique, I don't know if some of you have seen the issue of NKA on the global Black consciousness. We actually featured that in an essay by Baba from South Africa. In some of the journals that you mentioned, actually, it's important to mention a gallery magazine that was actually out of Rhodesia. Out of Zimbabwe. Sorry to use the name Rhodesia to describe Zimbabwe. But it was one of the magazines that also didn't last. And that's the sad thing, is that magazines like Revue, the gallery magazine South Africa, and other initiatives didn't last long. And we are happy that we're still publishing, you know. So the only other one that is really active or that survived for so many years is International Review of African American, if I can have a comparison.
So I want to move on to some other highlights in your career, and one of which was 7 Stories about modern art in Africa, which was an important exhibition with curator Clementine Delis and co-curators from African countries, including Chika from Nigeria and David Kolwane from South Africa, Elaji Sey from Senegal, and Wanjiku Nyache on Kenya and Uganda. And you curated works from Sudan and Ethiopia. What was your opinion on the exhibition, looking back on it now, you know, some 26, 27 years later, and your experience of working on it from the inside?
I think it is one of the most important, actually, exhibitions, or if you think of it as a publication. It's a truly landmark. There is a lot of criticism about it, but then people have to remember that there was an early interest in African art in the era of decolonization, I would say, shortly after independence movement in Africa. And that was highlighted by several exhibitions like the one in the Camden Center in the 1960s that brought several African artists. But there was a gap after that, and the interest in African art had dropped completely in the 70s, post-70s, especially 80s and 90s. And that actually, for 2 reasons. One, that had to do with the rise of the crisis of the post-colonial state in Africa. Soon you see military coups in Nigeria, Sudan, and many other places. That is due to the fact that, the intervention of the World Bank, the crisis that created by the IMF, the decline of public subsidy for art education, because the centers like in Nigeria, Ahmadu Bello University, where the Zaria rebel groups kind of came about, and then University of Khartoum, not University of Khartoum, but the College of Fine and Applied Art in Khartoum also was in the decline at that moment, and that is the beginning, with the era of the dictatorship of Jafar Numeri, if some of you would remember, which lasted from 1969 until 1985. And that's a long period of domination by military rule to destroy anything, let alone, of course, the whole economic crisis that it created led to the lifting of subsidies. That's what happened across Africa, the decline of higher education abroad, because this movement of Renaissance in the African art or modernist movement seemed to created around certain colleges and certain College of Fine Art that are actually established either by the French or by the British during the 1940s and after, mid-40s actually and after. But to get back to your question, if you can remind me, because it's important, which is, your interest in 7 Stories and what do I think of it. So 7 Stories, I think, is a landmark exhibition. First of all, came as an invitation from Clementine Delis, who was the brain behind it, and I'm very grateful to her for inviting me, among other curators. I thought it provided an opportunity to highlight movements selectively. So it chooses places that are of its strength. It's not the only one. These are not the only important movements. And at the time, of course, Africa is still in the context, used in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. So places that are vibrant like Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, even Tunisia, were not included, but actually included separately in other shows, like a show that was parallel to Africa, 70 Stories in the Barbican. But you have to remember that, that 70 Stories were the part of a larger festival that's called Africa 95, which was initiated by a group of British, and the late Robert Loder was actually a major figure who was actually, people must recognize his role in this. So 70 Stories invited about 4 or 5 African curators. So he didn't assume, like in early exhibition, that a European or a Euro-American or a British or a German to take over. So, and it came also as part of a dialogue between the curators. They arrived at the scene of modernity. They arrived as thinking of it as a two-way movement. So if you read the introduction, you will see from that time, there was a criticism of modernity, of Euro-American modernity, and thinking about it globally. So that's a major plus. And to think of it as modernism as a two-way traffic, and not to think of it as isolated unit, and to think about modernity as a project that is global, is inseparable. There is an inseparability of modernity because of the factor of colonialism and decolonization alike. It's not a one-way effort. And to actually analyze the work of African artists or modernists, not in an isolated way or to think of it as just influenced by Europe, but to think of them as people who lived that era in a hybrid way. Their modernity is shaped as part of their journey of the freedom to interrogate, to look at art objects. So one could not think of them as an isolated. Like from the beginning, the perception of African modernism is not something that is created in isolation of other modernism. It's in dialogue with others. And so I would say in that show, the kind of beginning of dialogue, there was a famous essay by Okben Wezo who was very critical of the show, but nevertheless, it also shows that's the beginning of a dialogue. So the show, even with some of its maybe shortcomings or whatever you can characterize, although I disagree, I think we did what we can at the time with what's available to us in terms of training or understanding of African art, and we enter into a dialogue to shape that.
Sorry for the interruption. I think we're clear now.
Okay. So what I'm saying, this is what I think is that there was a dialogue between the curators. We tried to relate our, like the different movement. But then also, if you look at the catalog, it's a document. It was actually a pioneering document in the debate on modern African art, because it has, beside the essays on the major movement that we took as 7 stories, as a, kind of a sign of 7 different stories, there was the other part of the book itself, which are very important, which is republishing of major, including translation from Arabic, at least I know in my division, of major manifestos, of major essays on schools of art, so you'll find that that section was very useful and eye-opener for many students of the generations to come after that. So in that sense, I think it's a pioneering show, and it set the tone for other shows that to come after.
I was looking at your bio and I came across this exhibition. I know that you had some meetings in 2001 with the Forum of African Arts. And following this, you curated authentic, eccentric exhibition with Olusegun at the 49th Venice Biennale, which was in 2001. So this must have been one of the first exhibitions on contemporary African art in Venice. What was important about this exhibition?
Yeah. First of all, let me correct this, because there are some other exhibitions prior to that. There is one that came as a traveling show from the Studio Museum in Harlem by Grace Stanislaus. It was a show that was traveling that included several contemporary African artists. There was also a show that was curated, I think, by Susan Vogel. Part of it also traveled. But these are shows that are traveling, but not really part of the idea of a pavilion itself. But also, we must not forget that prior to that, Egypt has a pavilion from the 1940s. That's very important to register. If we think of Africa or the presence of Africans there. So there are, and there are in rare occasions, Harald Zeman and so forth chose one artist or the other in the show. So there are there's no consistent, kind of representation of the continent. What we did, and I tell you the idea where it came from, because there was a show prior to that that's called Modernities and Memories. And that show was curated in the Venice Biennial before, I think it would be 1999. And it was funded by the Ford Foundation at Rockefeller. And the force behind it was a colleague called Damien Pono, and another colleague also from the Ford Foundation at the time. And it chose artists, among them Abdullah Konati, Rashid Qureshi, Adil Asiwi from Egypt, and artists from India and other places. It meant to represent art from the Islamic world. In fact, there was an interesting debate at that one, where, should we call it Muslim artists? I objected to that. I thought artists themselves, and what is a Muslim artist? And we said, okay, let's just create a theme of modernity and thinking about it in the context of memories, and also have it as just artists from the Islamic world, since the funders wanted to, as an initiative, to focus on the Islamic world. So we brought people from Pakistan, India, and the Arab world, and of course, North Africa specifically is very well represented. That show happened in a convent behind the academia page, and there is a catalog. So I wanted just to remind people that there were efforts prior to that. But the authentic eccentric, which focused on conceptualism in Africa, became an exception because it came as a major initiative that's funded by Ford Foundation. And there is a great officer at the time from the Congo, an ethnomusicologist by the name of Damien Pono, who was actually saw the first show and being part of it, that Modernities and Memories. And I remember in one of the bridges, he said, why don't you guys do something that represents Africa as a globe? And I said, you know what? We have been thinking about this for a long time, but funding is an issue. And he said he will fund it. And of course, at that time, NKA, through our work, we had relationship with African Creation, which has been generous to us through Florence Alexis, and then also Els van der Plas took over the helm of the Prince Claus Fund. So I must acknowledge that the star had a line, is that there was a group of people, either Africans or others, who were really sympathetic to the cause at the time. And they're young, vibrant officers in several organizations. Florence Alexis was in African Creation. You have Els van der Plas at the Prince Claus Fund, which was just being established at that time. And then you have at the Ford. So one must acknowledge the role of those individuals. Things don't happen just by accident. So what we did to institutionalize this, we created several meetings in which there are several people who are part of this initiative. I recall names. Of course, our colleague Koyo Kuo was a part of that. Okwe Nwezor was a major force in those meetings. Ibrahim al-Salahi, also from London. There were, several, figures who helped us a great deal. Jilain Tawadros, specifically from Innova. So we had several meetings, and we called it the Forum for African Art. We wanted to establish something that can be permanent body to exhibit in Venice and in other projects, in other places, or other forums in the north. And we created what we call it Africa in Venice project. We were against the idea of having it as a pavilion that represents Africa, because we cannot claim to represent Africa. So we called it the Forum for African Art, Africa in Venice Project 1. And the second one that followed this is Fault Lines, which was curated by Jilain Tawadros. And one thing that we tried to do in this, especially if you look at the list of the artists, we tried as much as possible. It focused on conceptualism in Africa, and we tried to argue that as conceptualism as when unfolding in the West in the 1960s and 70s, it was also unfolding in Africa, because African artists are not isolated. And we gave examples from Sudan, from South Africa, from other places. And so, but then one thing that we tried to do is to balance gender, which was very important to us at the time. Zainab Sadira, Bernie Sell, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, there was Godfrey Donkor, and the other artists. And in fact, we didn't I don't know if you have more images, you could show them from that, or the list of artists. You will see that it's as diverse as possible. But also one thing that distinguished this project is that all the works are commissioned. We didn't take a ready-made one, it was commissioned. And we had a great designer, Tom Posma, who actually volunteered his labor. He's from the Netherlands, an architect. And then we decided also, one thing that the strategy we followed is that we did not want to marginalize Africa in Venice itself. And we felt we have to do it in a space near the academia, which is Fondazione Levi. And we were aided by that by the Querini Stampalia Foundation. Also, there is a great, friend there, Chiara Bertola, played a great role in. So I wanted to say that in the journey to do this, the story behind is very important, because it tells you that you cannot do it alone. You have to have allies. You have to have people who really believe in your mission. It's at the time that there was so much bias, so much Euro-American domination in the art world, and it wasn't easy. The other thing that I would say this, and I will end it here, is that we decided to do a publication that is scholarly. And we did this with Fault Line and Authentic Eccentric. Commissioned essay on different subjects that had to do with conceptualism, and African conceptualism specifically, in relation to Euro-American conceptualism or global conceptualism. And then on the other side, we wanted specific essays on those artists, because we felt it's important to position them in a part of an academic discourse too. And that with that, we really we have succeeded. The book remains as an important document. The second one, which is the one that is Fault Lines, as curated by Jilain Tawadros, we did the same. It was divided into two parts, one on the artist and general essays that are theoretical. And that is very important, because, as I said, we took these shows to actually find the raw material, that is artists that are not, artwork by artists that are not well known, have them in a show, meaning expose them. As I use the motto is that if you don't exhibit, you don't exist. And then the last is to do an academic book on them, to put them in the map, because that's the only way that the Euro-American art historians can understand, okay? And so within NKA, which we designed it with the same quality, like any other American or European journal, the same thing we insisted on having this. I was asked why Venice by several African-based curators. And in the field of African art, there is a lot of nativism. there is this always cry about I'm based in Africa and I'm authentic more than the other. People have to understand is that people migrate and move for different reasons, but it doesn't mean that they don't know Africa or the very fact that they're not based in Africa. So I hate this inside exile that you have it actually, guys, in South Africa. It happened in the post-apartheid era. So in the field, there was this kind of, but why Venice? Because many people, I remember in the press conference asked me, why don't you do it in Africa? I said, you know, I can't do it in Africa, but if you can do it in Africa, go ahead and do it. I did it in Venice because it's the marketplace of ideas, marketplace of other things, and it is an exposure for these artists. And definitely, the result is that many of these artists, of course, Yinka was known by that time, but then Zainab Sabira, Bernie Sell, all these other artists, Donkor and others, their career is skyrocketed. And it is important for us to mention this because Venice has been the forum that gave them that. And the books that existed has been the forum that provided them with the texts that actually traveled in the academy and others. Now it becomes a normal thing, but it wasn't like that before.
Salah, I think we're running out of time, so I'm going to have one last question. I mean, there are other projects that you did that were very interesting. I think this one was for Dhaka, 3x3. But, you know, more recent exhibitions shown in Charjah and toured, for example, this one. And I saw there was a special edition in NKA on the Egyptian surrealists. But I want
to right now here.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for the promotion of NKA. We will all order online. But one last question. I think you have done more than anyone else to, you know, to make visible the work from East Africa, and of course, especially Sudan and Ethiopia in the 7 Stories exhibition. And I think you're quite noted for your publication on Ibrahim el-Salahi, and there was the exhibition at the Tate Modern at the time. Do you want to comment on your relationship with the artist and your work with him over this time?
Let me just assert one thing. One thing that I started doing after doing these kind of group shows, I felt the shows are not necessary anymore. I've done it with the earlier period, like to do several group shows, including the one in Venice itself. But there is one thing that I always insisted on, is that it is time not to just run after the most fashionable, just to do contemporary, like artists who are known and so forth, and to do catalogs similar to what European artists are doing. I felt the mission at this time, and the most urgent task that we should attend to, is to really document the modernist movement, either as movements or as artists. I don't mind working on contemporary artists. I continue to work on them, but I felt it is very important to do. If you notice, I did 2 types, the Khartoum School, just to give you as an example, and also the Egyptian Surrealists. And I must acknowledge here that the Egyptian Surrealists is not a project that I did alone. I did it with Hur al-Qasimi, the president of the Charjah Art Foundation, with whom I collaborated also on other projects. So I did work like with, on Ahmed Mursi, that just came out as a book, and that's not as a propaganda, just to acknowledge the fact that we did. One is called A Dialogic Imagination, just published by Skira. And then, of course, I did the Ibrahim al-Salahi one, which is actually, people always mention the Tate, and I must correct this, that this project could not have happened if it's not for the Charjah Art Foundation. And that's very important to acknowledge, is that often the big names takes over. I'm very grateful to the Tate Modern, very grateful to Chris Derkon, Elvira, Diangani, and all the people who were there. You know, especially Jessica Morgan, who's now heading the Dia Foundation in New York. Moved to London, which gave that kind of an exposure. But Charjah Art Foundation is the one that funded the book funded the exhibit, funded the travel of it too, of the Khartoum school. And so what I'm saying that is, my comment on this is that that's the task. I feel it is important for scholars and curators of African art to focus on documenting art movements, producing books, that is for dissertation, others like Chika's book on post-colonial modernism. These are the most important now, is to really document the movement, put it on the map, have it as part of the academic discourse, but also available to younger generations. And instead of a rush to celebrate only contemporary art, which is an important task, but it shouldn't stop us from that task. That's why I just wanted to notice the shift to documenting movements and to documenting like modern artists, and even if you work on the contemporary. So some of the shows that are actually coming this coming year, one is on Gavin Yantis, your own South African artist who lives in London. There is a retrospective on him that's planned for the fall 2023 after the Charjah Biennial Foundation, sorry, the Charjah Art Biennale. And then there is one on Rashid Quraishi. So these are the things that and then there is one on Kamala that that's going to happen soon in London at the Serpentine. Not announced yet, but it's not a secret. So for me, that's the most urgent task for documenting these artists, producing good scholarly work on them so they can be in the map and they can be taught.
Okay, thank you, Salah. I think it's really great to hear that you've still got so much energy, so many ideas, that we can look forward to a lot of really interesting projects still coming, because on one hand, it would be nice to have more time to talk about some of the projects that you have done. But I think you've brought us to a point in terms of giving us a taster of what we can also look forward to. I've been wrestling with Riason here because he's got a whole lot of questions, but I think we do want to give a few minutes at least to people here to pose any questions to you. Who would like to ask anything to Salah, please?
By the way, I should mention that Chris Deacon is in the audience, so just to let you know.
Is my internet, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, there's a kind of an interruption, so say hello to Chris. I can't see his name here, but.
Okay,
he's
who
a
would
dear
like
friend.
to go?
He deserves the recognition. Hello?
Malik is coming.
We're just waiting for a question. Hang on a second.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank Salah for all the struggle on contemporary African art, and particularly all the job he did with NKA. I would like also to ask a question about African modernity, because you talk about this modernity. I would like to know from his own perspective if he could now describe more main characteristic of these modernities. What would be somehow 5 or 3 characteristics of this African modernity today? Thank you.
Wow, that's a long question. That's a lifetime question.
Yeah, I feel like we've been asked to present a lecture.
I mean, you could have stopped me earlier to be brief, but that's the tendency of the teacher in me. Once you get into it and then you find, but I try to control myself actually. Actually, my son is my critic, because recently I just gave a talk and they told me 4 minutes. I gave the 4 minutes and he was very grateful. He said, you actually did it in 4 minutes. So I will try to be very brief. First of all, if I could talk about an African modernity, I want to talk about it in a global sense, but also continental sense. In a continental sense, feature number 1 is uneven. meaning the rise of the modern movement in places like Egypt, South Africa, and parts of North Africa is actually earlier. And in the, meaning at the beginning of the 20th century, even prior to that, because in Egypt, you find the College of Fine Applied that was established in the late 19th century. So that's important to recognize, is that it depends. It evolved in a different way. So there is no one way of talking about it. So that is one. So it's diverse, and it's multiple, and it's also uneven. The feature number one. Feature number two, of course, it is intertwined to Western modernism. If you talk about the fine art, I'm not talking about other, because the same questions of to be modern has been asked. In the Arab world, it is a 19th century question, even prior to that, because there was the concept of Nahda, or Renaissance, or revival in the Arab world that had been discussed in the 19th century. These questions are as early as the 19th century. So that is important to understand. But then, in the context of the rest of Africa, I think it is associated with the decolonization. So that's another feature, meaning it was born in the search for a new identity of a new nation that you call the post-colonial myth. So the question of being modern and being part of this larger global came in that kind of context, the colonial context. The third feature of it is that it's actually liberatory, meaning it's part of the liberation project. We cannot think about modernity outside that in many countries, meaning it came as part of the struggle for decolonization, a search for a new identity. That is very important in terms of the language. So the language that actually created, if I can think about a visual vocabulary, which is if you can think about the feature that's forced, is actually in dialogue with the classical tradition of each, because that question has always been there, is that if you look at the major modernists, they came out of colonial education. There's no doubt about it. Either as independent, self-taught, but they can, you have to remember, these are people who, because of media, because of film, because of magazines and others, looked at other people's work. So the tradition, a combination of that, it is based in the colonial education, it is based in the training in the European tradition, and this is, you can think about, Ahmadu Bello University, Khartoum, fine art, Egypt. Most of them went to France, like Mahmoud Mukhtar and so forth, and Mahmoud Said. You'll find that most of them somehow are in dialogue with the West. And that's not something to be shy about or to try to kind of insist on the authenticity. I hope that can answer you in a brief way.
Okay, well, thanks. That was quite crisp. I'm going to abuse my position here because it's a question I really do want to ask, if I may. That is, Salah, you spoke a few times about the issue of academic or publications being accessible. You spoke about it in relation to Revue Noire. You also mentioned it in terms of NKA. It's clear that you do occupy a number of strategic positions and you have influence. I mean, the fact how you define your relationship to Duke University Press is interesting. And when I say you, I understand that you are always working with others and as part of a collective. But you indicated, for example, that you've managed to retain control of the content, and you've also managed to retain control of the design. I think these are achievements in the sense that often when journals that are independently founded form alliances with big institutions and that are publishing, especially academic publishers, they often lose a lot of control in terms of the publication. So the issue that I'm personally concerned with is this question of access, because I think as you know, the subscription journals are working within a particular kind of economic model that is becoming increasingly difficult for many people to access. A lot of scholars in Africa, those even attached to universities, many universities are cutting back on the journals that they're actually subscribing to. There are many independent scholars. I mean, from the end of this month, I will have no university affiliation, and I mean, there are many other people. Is there any way that, I understand that there's a profit, they're investing money, they need to recoup money, but if you look at, say, how long NKA has been published for example, And I don't only want to focus on NKA here, because I think this is a broader challenge in terms of publishing. But is there a way to engage with academic publishers in a way that at least, for example, earlier editions can be made accessible online without subscription, without the kind of fees that people have to pay? Is there no way that one can at least concede that they have a means to recoup the money that they put in, but they don't actually become a profit-oriented publishing business? Because really, at the end of the day, a lot of important publications are not accessible, and it's increasingly becoming a problem. So, is this an issue that concerns you at all? And if so, how do you see a way of actually engaging with that issue?
Well, it is an important question, and we have been engaged with this question, myself, Chika, OKK, and because in talking to Duke, this has always been an issue that we have in mind. But you have to remember also, at the same time, we wanted to maintain the journal. So the opportunity to work with Duke was to stabilize the journal. And to make it accessible, actually, it is an important question that you raised. We, at some point, from the issues that we get, we used to, even when the magazine was published by us in the beginning, us meaning myself, Chika and Olu or Okwi, and then of course there was a support. There was a full support actually from Cornell, one must acknowledge. That's the only reason for the survival, really, of this, because it provided a managing editor, it provided an office space that's generous, and it's provided subsidy to Duke, okay? We pay subsidy for it. We don't make any money out of this. Even when we get, the model is that when the magazine makes some profit, it actually just cut on the subsidy, amount of subsidy that we have. So that's the model we're working with Duke. But then you actually raised an issue that we must revisit, because at the beginning we used to have about a 180 something issue that we get, and we try to distribute them to major, like let's say libraries or how they call it, or institutes or galleries in the continent. And we still do with the issues that we get, because we have a certain number of issues that we get free from Duke. And of course, with the online, I think we should push for that, and we should try with Duke to.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got about only 5 minutes.
You inspired me, or you reminded me actually to revisit, because we are really struggling just to make sure that it gets published, that we have enough essays, we have a good managing editor, and so to make it survive, because that we felt was a priority. But what you raised is very important. Okay, the issue of sending it, but online is actually the easiest way.
Okay, well, thank you for your response. As I said, we've only really got a few more minutes. Chris, you want to come into Chris Ekwemesi, do you want to come into the question? I think after Christy, we must close now.
Thank you, Salah Hassan, for your present interventions. I must say that you and your group colleagues have done a very excellent job, work over the years. But I want to ask if there has been any conscious effort among you people as a group or as individuals to ensure that what you have done overseas over the years have some impact in art training, art dissemination, administration on the continent. Have you done that, or do you have plans of making sure, because some of these things published never get down to Africa, even when they are available, people cannot really afford them. So have you made individual or group efforts to ensure that your work impacts or influences the thinking of artistic thought. In Africa, I teach art at the University of Nigeria, for instance. Some of the things we just hear, read about them, but they never really trickle down to the continent to be able to impact some kind of development. Thank you.
With what we can, I mean, with the power we can, of course, one major idea is that we encourage training of students at the PhD level, like myself, Chika, among other people. In fact, not only Africans, but also, Euro-American scholars have been making that effort lately, is to try to accept in the PhD program the largest number of Africans that you can. And it's not easy because these programs are competitive, and it's also that there is a decline in the education, in higher education in Africa in terms of theoretical training, but that's one area, is to train a new generation of scholars. The reason I actually moved to try to establish this Africa Institute, and I encourage you to go to our website, it's called the africainstitute.org. Our mission is really to try to provide education, a critical education African study, including, we already hired art historians. We already have at least 2 art historians in our staff, which is, we will be accepting our first group of graduate students in 2023. That's another area where I was encouraged by the location of Charjah and its proximity to Africa and establishing relation with African universities to do that. The other idea is, of course, access. Access is a big question, of course, because of the inequality in access globally. And I think that's the struggle that should be not our own, everyone to push the universities, to push publishers and so forth. I was recently as part of the, for about 3 years, as part of the book award committee that used to be called the Heskovich. It's no longer called that, for the African Studies Association. And as a group, collectively, we issued a statement, we handed to the leaders of the African Studies Association and their offices, is that it's important for them to think about African-based publishing, is to create partnership and to have access and to reverse the process. Because we noticed in all the books that we give award to, 99% are European or American-based publishers. And the names like Duke University, Cambridge, these are the ones that winning. So we try to say, we have to try to, it's a long proposal to try to do something about this issue of kind of, leveling the playing field or whatever you call it. So that's an effort. The other effort is, I think, is what Mario just mentioned, which is really to push European and other publishers to provide access. There are now consciously certain magazines and certain journals push for that, for the free access. But I'm not sure these other university publishers are actually struggling in the post-COVID and even prior to that from support. So it is an issue. It is an issue that had to be tackled. And trust me, we will try to do that. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, I think unfortunately we are 30 minutes behind schedule and we still have 2 more conversations. Chris Deacon, we can take a comment, but if it's a question, I regret.
No, I just want to make a comment because I'm supposed to ask difficult questions this afternoon. Some of us are working in difficult situations. I hope we don't have to work for the regime of Marine Le Pen in 14 days. But you and I, because I'm also involved in the Gulf, we are working with the Africa Institute. I'm working with other institutions in the Middle East, and we are working in a difficult situation. The Emiratis is not, the country of the promised land, isn't it? I mean, so what about the situation, the context of the Africa Institute in the Gulf?
First of all, I always, when people ask me about the African Institute and why an African Institute in Charjah, I tell them, why not? Because if I can have an African Institute or African Studies Institute in France, Paris, in UK, SOAS, or in North America, why not here? It's closer even to the continent. And if you're talking about, these are the former, you know, colonial metropoles that actually control the debate and the discourse on African studies. But there is another history to it, actually. Why there is an African Institute in Charjah? People don't know that in 1976, there was a conference on Afro-Arab relations called for by the ruler of Charjah, who's a scholar in his own right, Dr. Sultan bin Muhammad al-Qasimi. And he's interested in history. He is an author. He did his PhD in history. He talked about, he has a book on the fall of the Omani Empire, and another book on the partition, of the myth of piracy in the Gulf. So there was that interest in 1976 of a conference on solidarity between African and Arabs. And intellectuals such as Ali Mazrui, Koli Omotosh, who still lives in South Africa, and then Hisham Sharabi, the major Palestinian scholar who taught at Georgia, all of these people, young at the time, vibrant, came here, gave an amazing conference, and were working on documentation of it in a book and a film. And the recommendation from that conference, 73, is to establish the Africa Institute, an African Studies Institute here. Fast forward 40 years after, I was invited because of my visits here. In terms of context, what we really try to do is to think about the locale. If I can answer you, is that I know there is a subtext to what you mentioned, but in terms of locale, this is actually a very important place because it allows us to think about Africa in terms of the Indian Ocean circulation and the Red Sea. So in designing, we are at the stage of designing the curriculum itself. We try to think about the locale. So Afro-Arab relations, Indian Ocean circulations that's anchored in the east coast of Africa, Hajj and other linkages with Africa through the Red Sea, slavery in the past, okay, immigration and labor now, all of those issues, that history of Afro-Arab relations is very important to think about because it is a terrain that is even then has been a place of tension. Whenever there are two issues that always come up when you think about Afro-Arab relations. One is, of course, slavery in the past, and the other one is also the issue of Palestine. So these are two issues that have been debated even at that then. But what is important for me, if I try to think about Afro-Arab relations, but also Africa itself, because you have to remember, one of the things that made it easier for us also here is that half of the Arab world is in the continent of Africa. If you think about Egypt, part of Sudan and others, Morocco, Tunisia, all of them have this double affiliation. So the intersection of Pan-Africanism and Pan-Arabism has been highlighted a long time ago. So what I'm hoping for is that this becomes an academic center, a think tank, okay, but also a place for publishing and translation. We're starting with, it's a PhD program only and master's degree, in addition to an African language and translation program, and a vibrant, actually, publishing place that would benefit from the support. So at a time when there's a decline in terms of support for education in Africa, this is an opportunity for me and for many others who join to really build a new institute that's not burdened by the colonial or decolonization that people talk about in other places. This is an opportunity to build something based on the latest discourses of African art, of African studies, meaning that transcend these things and think new. And also, we do not want to replicate what other institutions do. We want to think. That's why the locale is very important. That's why issues that are not well studied. For example, African feminism. For example, we want to have it as part of a whole, gender and sexuality studies, and thinking also about African intellectual traditions, globally and continentally. That's one of the focuses that we want to focus on. Migration, labor, slavery, all of those things are going to be some of the subjects that we will distinguish ourselves from having. And also, we're trying to hire a new generation of Africanists that could lead this charge. So if you think about context, what is the West had to offer that is better than here, in a sense that the study of Africa should be a field that is studied Africa. Of course, there will always be limitations. There will always be issues that may not, as it happened in even the context of North American universities. Now there is a debate that critical race theory cannot be taught. Certain states take a state decision in their parliament or Congress or Senate, whatever, to banish post-colonial studies, to ban certain texts. These are issues that we will face in any context, but this is an opportunity to build something new. And I thought the group of people that we have so far attracted as faculty are people who are very critical, very conscious of the world around them, knows the politics of everything, and can create something that would be a place that will attract and other linkages and so forth. We're also not building it, by the way, in a vacuum. From the beginning, we did a conference as an opening for the Institute, declaring it. It's called the Global Africa, the State of African Studies, African Diaspora in the 21st Century. And we invited representatives of the Critical Humanities Center in Cape Town, so University of Western Cape. We invited Weiser in Johannesburg, at the Wits University, the African Studies Center that goes back to the Nkrumah days, is still vibrant at the University of Ghana, Legon. We invited people from Cairo, from Ethiopia, the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, to establish linkages. We wanted to do these linkages, but not in isolation from the West, because I don't believe in this creating new centers on ethnocentrism. I wanted it to be a vibrant place. So we welcome a connection with you, Chris. We already have a discussion about this, and I know you have other projects in your mind too for collaboration. We are open to all of these things. We wanted to build, but we also want to focus. We cannot do everything. We can do what we can with the limitation of human resources that we have, or man and women power.
Salah, sorry, I have to interject. That was a very comprehensive response. Thank you. I'm very sorry to have to cut you off like this. We're just very behind schedule. The other speakers are online and are waiting. So I just want to thank you very much and ask people to express some appreciation for Salah. Thank you
so much.